practical approaches to organ registration, focusing on creating an appropriate and effective sound for hymns and choral accompaniments, and of course within the context of the worship service. We will cover foundational principles, common pitfalls, and strategies for maximizing the sonic potential of various organs. And that's the thing, is every organ is different, and also every room is different, and the room is a major component of, of the instrument. The organ is also a living instrument. It changes over time. It is affected by climate. It is affected by temperature and humidity and all of that. Sometimes a very humid air will make a room more reverberant, will perhaps enhance bright treble sounds. Sometimes really cold weather will actually muffle the sound and make the organ sound softer or less homogeneous, if you will. So the organ changes, and what I have found personally is that creating what I call a romantic crescendo on the organ, which is where everything is coupled to the main manual and to the pedal, and it's set in several levels of different dynamics, and that gives me flexibility to adjust the volume of the organ depending on the size of the choir that particular Sunday, or the acoustics, the way that the weather is impacting the humidity. The weather is impacting the acoustics in the space at any given time. So, with all things that go without saying, I actually feel that they're best said anyway. And so I like to start with all the basics of what make the sounds of the organ. And I think we need to just go through the resources of the organ, and basically an organ consists of several different divisions. It depends on the size of the instrument, but there's often a swell. In this case, there are three manuals. There's a swell, there's a positive, this one is under expression, so it could very well be called a choir. And then there's a grave, and then there's a pedal. And each of these divisions has its own character, and also voicing of stops. And the stop families, there's basically four different families of stops. There's the principal, also known as diapasons, and these stops provide the foundational sound of the organ. They also provide clarity and grandeur. Some of them are called open diapason, principal, octave, super octave, sometimes sub-octave, depending on the nationality of the organ. There are also flutes, that's the second family of pipes. They usually create a softer, a warmer, and a more mellow sound, and some names that you might have seen are Brondel, gedeckt, Rohrflöte, sometimes even stopped diapason, which is a misnomer because it sounds like it might be a diapason, but it actually is a very fluty diapason. Or flute harmonique, right? Using the French term, which is basically a traverse flute sound. Then there are strings, and strings are the third family of pipes. They are a foundation, but they are brighter and more incisive than the diapasons or the flutes, and they often have a slightly reedy quality. For example, stops that are strings are solitional, viola de gamba, voix celeste. It's a string that's tuned a little sharp, so that it produces. If you have a gamba here, the celeste is a little higher, and together it creates this undulating effect. Right? Those are string stops. And then the fourth, the last but not least family of pipes is reeds. And reeds are a very important component of any organ because they impart a brassy, orchestral, or vocal quality. And some of the stops that you hear that you see that are reeds can be called trumpet, crumhorn, cornhorn, oboe, hautbois, clarinet, bassoon, English horn, tuba mirabilis, organ stops come at different pitches. The main central pitch, and the one that matches the piano, is the 8-foot pitch. And basically, this is middle C on the organ, which is the same as middle C on the piano. This one's a little lower pitch than the piano, but that's normal because it has to be cool in here, and in cooler temperatures, organs tend to settle a little low. But basically, give or take, 8-foot pitch is what corresponds to what you get on the piano keyboard. And then you have stops that are at 16 foot that play an octave below, and usually those add gravitas, depth, and fullness. They're usually used in the pedal, but also sometimes in foundational manual registrations on keyboard to again add that gravitas also in the hands. Then you also have 4-foot stops. They play the octave above. When you bring on a 4-foot, it adds a little brightness, clarity, and definition. And later, when I demonstrate the romantic crescendo that I created on this organ, you'll see how it all just stacks up and makes sense. The 2-foot stop plays 2 octaves above the 8-foot. And definitely the 2-foot is added to add brilliance and sparkle. And in fact, a lot of mixtures start at the 2-foot pitch. That means that the lowest sounding rank of the mixture is the 2-foot pitch, which is 2 octaves above the fundamental that you're playing. Mixtures is another stop that you will encounter. They can be called mixture, they can be called fourniture, they can be called plangeur, and then they are usually followed by a Roman numeral, which indicates the number of ranks. Also, sometimes a number, it indicates a pitch, like 2-foot, meaning that it starts at the 2-foot pitch, or it might be a higher mixture. Mixtures that start higher than that, I would say beware, especially the ones called scharf, or things like that. They tend to start at the 1-foot pitch, and they can be extremely squeaky to the point that they really disturb our canine friends because the frequencies are just so high. But mixtures, basically their purpose is to add brilliance, presence, and a sense of bloom to the sound, either to compare it to basically once you have the full foundational sound of the organ on, you basically add that little crown on top that just makes everything shine. But a mixture in proper proportion should really only sit at the top and just add a brilliance that is missing. It shouldn't obliterate, it shouldn't take over everything else that you have underneath, right? Any of the lower pitches. So mixtures used with caution. Then there are also mutation stops, and those can be called Nazard 2 2/3, or tierce 1 3/5, or larigot 1 1/3. And those stops basically don't play the fundamental, they play the harmonic. So this is middle C. The Nazard at 2 2/3 plays an octave and a half above, and then you have the 2-foot, and then above that you have the 3rd, right? And it creates a really cool color, which is useful. That's also called the cornet, and it is a useful solo stop. Sometimes you want to bring out a certain melody in a hymn without being, too blatant about it, but you want to bring it out. It creates a very interesting color. Once you have so many pitches, different pitches that are not the fundamental, the ear stops separating them. You, of course, as the organist, are aware of all the pitches, but the people who listen to it find it fascinating because they hear the fundamental, but then they hear all these overtones about it. And actually, and I know it's not the point of this class, but basically this note actually has a lot of overtones in it that we can't perceive. But basically, if you really analyze the sound, what we're hearing is this. Sorry, the octave above, the 5th above, the 4th above, the 3rd above. This is what we actually hear, but much quieter above that fundamental. So it works, and when you do it in a way that is appropriately scaled, for example, everything should be softer above it, softness to do, then you can have right. It can create a really neat effect, and in fact, it can have a tender feel. All right, so those are non-octave speaking stops, and they add color and harmonic interest. But again, you want to use them sparingly. You don't want to use them in everything because you don't need to enhance every harmonic all the time. All right, I mentioned earlier that the acoustics of the space are a major component. So you have to consider the reverberation time, the size, and the materials of the performance space. Is the space made of stucco? Is it made of bricks? Is it made of stone? Is it made of marble? All of that affects the sound, and ultimately it will affect how the organ projects in the room. And that will also affect how you register for either hymn accompaniment or choral accompaniment. But basically, you don't have to worry too much about them, just be aware of it. And then when you start building a romantic crescendo, just go by what you hear and how it sounds. And especially not necessarily what it sounds like at the console, but what you know it sounds like out of the room. And it might be helpful to have a friend or a colleague that you trust come and give you feedback as you build that romantic crescendo at first. All right, so then also artistic intent is important. What is the desired mood that you want to create with different registrations? What is the character of the piece that you are registering? And what is the emotional impact? Like, is it supposed to be an introspective piece? Is it supposed to be a hymn about victory? Is it the Hallelujah chorus? All of those different moods require different registrations. Balance. Balance is key. It doesn't matter what you register. Everything needs to be balanced at all times. And for example, I'll show you a little bit of the romantic crescendo that I created on here. And basically, everything at every level needs to sound balanced. This is the softest registration on this organ, and then the next. It goes to the pedal as well, but what this achieves is a balance throughout, right? And I went through just 8 generals right now, from the softest sounds to slightly bigger and bigger and bigger, right? But the balance needs to remain so that it is a supportive sound, not only for the choir, but also for the congregation. If the congregation sings a hymn. Was that noticeable right now? Okay. Okay, let's see. So now registrations for hymns. Hymns are hymn playing and hymn accompaniment is really the fundamental purpose of the organ in the church. So I know that oftentimes we are just, well, okay, go ahead and accompany that. And those of us who got a degree in organ didn't necessarily learn about how to register a hymn, right? We just kind of have heard it, we kind of know, we just pull things out and then, hope for the best. But I think it is good to understand the very general principles of hymn accompaniment and to therefore make informed decisions about how to register. So these general principles are, number one, clarity and support. The organ's primary role is to support congregational singing and provide harmonic clarity. And that's when we do that the congregation feels supported and encouraged to sing. Building the sound. progress from lighter to fuller registrations as the hymn progresses, typically adding stops or divisions with each verse. And that's usually the normal construction of a hymn. Usually the first verse establishes the theme of the hymn, the topic, right? It also lets you know right away, is it going to be a triumphant hymn or is it going to be a more introspective, prayerful hymn? And then the following verses develop this idea. Maybe one of the middle verses will be quieter in mood. That's especially effective in a strong, victorious hymn. But sometimes, you never know, even a quieter hymn could have a really introspective or sad verse. And so that, of course, impacts how you're going to register things, and it's really convenient to have a romantic crescendo that really helps set that mood, depending on the text. And then the final verse usually is the conclusion of the first verse, and it basically brings home the meaning of that first verse in a sense that brings climax to it. So, analyze the hymns so that you know exactly how to register, how to pre-plan the dynamics of each verse. The dynamic range. So utilize the dynamic capabilities of the organ to create interest and emphasize textual meaning. So I just almost touched on that, basically, right? When you talk about victory and rising from the dead, and making it to heaven, you want to have those reeds available at you. Definitely in the swell. The box may be closed, but then you gradually open that box, and people will feel that sense of victory. Bum, 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 bum. The cavalry is here, victory is nigh, and that is that will make the hymns more meaningful to the people who sing it. It will create a connection between what you do and the subconscious connection between what you do and what the congregation perceives. And then to create variety, but without being distracting. In other words, no complex or jarring changes within, a verse. Don't go from forte to piano, because suddenly there is a word that says silently or quietly, and before that it was proudly we stand, and then but quietly we pray. Don't make anything too jarring. Create a mood for the entire verse, and suddenly open the box or close the box, but don't do any distracting or jarring changes in registration. And then common approaches by verse. So the first verse, as I mentioned, is the introduction, the opening of the hymn. So for that, in terms of registration, often a moderate, clear, and foundational sound is appropriate. So for example, you could have the A for principal, or the great A for flute, if it's a quieter hymn, with the A for principal, have the swell box closed, either full of everything or slightly less full without the upper work for something warmer. And so what that would sound like is potentially, for example, as a hymn introduction. This kind of registration, depending on the size of the space, depending on the size of the choir who's going to lead the congregational singing, this could be a good starting point. Now, you could, if you wanted, go up one more level, but for the introduction, write something moderate and clear that helps you establish tempo, mood, and give the congregation the clarity of what's going to be happening. The middle verses, so as I mentioned earlier, those are the verses that serve as development of the idea, of the theme of the hymn. So there you can introduce more stops to build intensity or explore different colors. And so the way you start adding more stops is basically in that romantic crescendo, you can go up one notch to the next dynamic level, or you can go down depending on whether it's a more introspective verse. And basically what you would do is once you've started with an 8-foot principal bass, then you can add 4-foot principals like I just did, or even a 2-foot, again depending on the size of the choir, of the congregation, of the space, the volume of the organ, etc. Right? Use your best judgment. Basically you can add to what you used for the introduction. So yeah, definitely for quieter verses, retreat to a softer combination. And then for narrative verses, consider that you're more illustrative or focused registrations, such as a solo stop, like the cornet that I demonstrated earlier, that you use that. Or use the oboe, if you have a beautiful oboe on the organ. If you're going to use an oboe, I recommend also adding a tremulant, because that tends to soften the oboe around the edges and make it more melodious. Right? It makes it more human sounding, as opposed to, it's still a beautiful oboe, but it doesn't have that same vocal quality, and it might be distracting. A vibrato, makes it more human sounding. And subliminally, it makes it more comfortable for people to actually enjoy. So keep that in mind. The final verse of the hymn, as I mentioned earlier, is the conclusion, is what brings home the premise of the first verse. So typically, that's where I use the fullest registration, incorporating a wide range of stops. However, be very careful of those mixtures I mentioned earlier. You could probably have the mixture in the swell, because those tend to be smaller in scale than the ones on the grade. I would say be very cautious about using things that are too harsh on the grade, like a sharp or a mixture or something like that. Just add them only if it makes sense. If you have everything else below, 16-foot to 2-foot below, and maybe even a pedal reed on, and then you can crown out the whole texture with a mixture. And so then the pedal line, what to do with the pedal? So the pedal needs to always be clear and supportive. It needs to start with 16 and 8-foot pitches, and then it needs to match the manual registration in terms of weight and character. Usually having everything coupled to the pedal helps. All the manuals coupled down to the pedal helps maintain that balance and connection with the registrations in the manual. And consider adding a soft 16-foot string or a flute in the pedal for lighter passages. And the reason I suggest a string is because a string will maintain a certain element of clarity, which is so important for rhythm. We know that people who are untrained musicians, the one thing they hear consciously is the melody on top, right? But what helps drive their sense of rhythm is the bass. And this is why, by the way, in pop music, rhythm is either really loud in the drum section or has a very throbbing bass guitar line with very clear articulation, right? And it's because the untrained ear sometimes cannot define rhythm without a clear bass. So for example, in a hymn, like the one I just demonstrated, if you do just one foundation, you don't want to be the pedal point in the bass. You want to have those repeated notes. You do want to repeat them and separate them in the pedal, so that people really feel that sense of rhythm and drive, and that will help propel them forward and not drag down or drag the rhythm, the tempo while they sing. And you will find that if your pedal is very soft, all flutes, and just woo, that will not have the same drive as if you have strings in the pedal, or you bring on the dive pacings in the pedal. Those stops have more definition and will help a huge amount in hymn accompaniment. Couplers are also refrain, like I mentioned. I couple everything to the grade. the solo as well, or the antiphonal division. If you have an antiphonal division, integrate it by coupling into the grade. That will help create a surround sound effect in the entire sanctuary that will help you avoid having to play everything too loud, because the entire congregation will be surrounded by sound. So definitely couple all of that to the grade and to the pedal. And then expression pedals. Here we have two of them, the swell and the choir, or they're both influenced, and that's very useful to effect slow crescendos during the verse. Those are crucial for dynamic shaping and expressive playing. So experiment with those. It's often great to start with the boxes mostly closed and then slightly open them during the verse, especially if the text suggests hopefulness. It's always good to slightly increase that volume by opening the boxes. And then if you go to the next level up, the next dynamic level up, close the boxes again a little bit and then slowly open them up. And that again keeps building that intensity in the accompaniment and also driving the theme of hopefulness and victory home. So, yeah. All right, now, registration for choral accompaniments. This is where the romantic crescendo that I demonstrated comes in even more handy, because with a choir you can do expressive things, dynamic variety that you can't do with a congregation of untrained musicians, right? So having at your disposal the full dynamic range of the organ already preset is going to be a life changer for you. And so the general principles to keep in mind as you prepare for a choral accompaniment on the organ. You want to support, but you don't want to obscure the choir or the soloist. And on Tuesday, when I first arrived at Powell Chapel and started preparing for the opening service, I set my romantic crescendo in 35 minutes, and there was a little bit of guessing involved. And Chami, one of the recent graduates of Baylor here, helped me by getting my ears in the middle aisle and saying, "Yeah, this is bounce note, maybe that's too prominent. Try a softer forefoot." Okay, great, wonderful. And that's so helpful because the console in Powell Chapel is off to the side, right against the wall, and the organ doesn't speak directly at the organ, right? So at the organist. So it's essential to have someone in the sweet spot of the room be your ears and your sounding board, right? So yeah, the general principle is to not obscure, not to cover up, not to overpower, right? And then we have the rehearsal with the brass and the pianist and the singers before the opening service. And after we went through the first hymn, Randall Bradley turned over to some of the staff members of the conference and said, "Niall, Matthew, how's the balance? How's the balance?" I was like, "Oh, it was great, but there was not enough organ." And I said, "At any particular point or throughout? Throughout, not enough organ." That's the best compliment that they could have given me, given that I had never played that organ before, never played in the space, and didn't know, right? So then all I knew to do is that, I'm going to bring everything up one notch at least in my romantic crescendo, and then we'll see how that works. But still, I didn't want to go up 2 notches and then potentially obliterate everything. So I brought everything up 1 level. We ran through it again, and then people were like, "Perfect." So, sometimes you're off the mark, but it's better to be under-registered than to be over-registered and overpower everything, right? The second principle that is important to keep in mind is to aim for a seamless blend with the choir and ensuring that individual vocal lines are clear. So that's when not overpowering everything is essential. You want to provide the support, and you want to be present, you want to add that warmth perhaps under the vocal lines, but in a way that the vocal lines still come through. So you want to provide that 8-foot foundation support, right? That is what is going to help support definitely the choral notes. So registration should reflect the mood of the anthem. It should reflect the dynamics and the meaning of the choral text. So if you have the choral arrangement of Psalm 23, right? So at first it starts very quietly, and gradually through Psalm 23, it actually grows more confident. I mean, first you go through, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, right? So probably the music is written in such a way that you could add, a Psalm 32 where it's really dark, creepy, right? And you can have the string celeste that add, a certain discrete shimmer and sense of doom, and but then gradually, you go, and surely, I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever, right? And so then obviously you want to bring out all the beats and the triumphant sound without obliterating again. So the text will guide, and the dynamics, and usually a well-crafted arrangement or a well-crafted anthem will have all the dynamics, all the info that you need to inform how you're going to register and which presets you're going to use. Rhythm and articulation. Yeah, so choose registrations that allow for clear articulation and rhythmic precision. If, for example, you're going to do the Hallelujah, right? You want clear, crisp registration. You want flutes and celestes and any kind of mellow sounds you want. Clear, you want diapasons, principles, maybe a soft reading of pedals, soft 16th reading the pedals so that the pedal line has clarity and verve without again obliterating anything. But you want to go for registrations that fit the writing of the piece. So common scenarios and approaches. So generally speaking, in anthems, the introduction of the anthem sets the mood. So it could be a moderate foundational sound. It's usually not the climax of the piece, so rarely will it start with full organ. It will often sound, it will often start maybe with an ethereal or mysterious sound. It depends on the piece, right? But basically analyze the structure of the piece and analyze how it starts and where it goes and the development. Is it darker? Is it brighter? And then does it go back to the same mood as the beginning, or does it actually go triumphant, right? So analyze the sections of the piece, the architecture of the piece. Then accompanying a full choir. So that requires often a clear, warm sound that blends well. So you do want flutes, you do want maybe soft strings that can give you a warm sound, but also provide the choir with clarity of pitch and rhythm. And principals, flutes are a good starting point. Avoid overly reedy or stringy sounds, like the really bright, buzzy strings are probably not going to be good because they will compete with the voices. And then accompanying unison or two-part choir for those situations, a lighter registration is better. Perhaps just a few 8-foots, maybe a few 4-foot flutes, usually will be enough. A soft principal combination, that will work. In smaller ensemble situations, you don't want to make the singers feel like they have to push, right? Because that will tire them out vocally. They will do funny vocal things if they push, that makes them sound like they're struggling. It makes the whole effort less successful. Accompanying a soloist or a small ensemble. So in that situation, you want a very light and transparent registration. So soft flutes, celestes, very quiet principals, the swell blows, all of that. So again, you want to support but not overpower in that situation. But oftentimes, an 8-foot stop is enough. Maybe at a climax of a solo, you might add more stops. Maybe go up one level in the romantic crescendo, then go back down. In fugal and contrapuntal sections, such as like the Amen chorus at the end of Handel's Messiah, after Worthy is the Lamb, right? There is that long Amen fugue. For that kind of section, you want a clear, articulate registration consisting of principals, maybe a few bright flutes, like 4-foot, maybe 2-foot, depending on how bright the 2-foot flute is, But the purpose of that is to highlight individual lines. So you want to avoid overly muddy registrations. Again, you don't want to have just flutes. You want some softer principles, quiet strings. Maybe an oboe if it's not too big with the box closed, just to keep rhythm, tempo clear for those contrapuntal sections. Usually when you get to the 2D section or the climax, then you can build to fuller registrations. So you could go up in number with your general pistons, but always be mindful of the choir's volume and tessitura. So you can incorporate mixtures, but again with caution. And same with the reeds on the grate, for example. Be very cautious. Those reeds tend to be so powerful that they will potentially obliterate everything. You might keep a big reed, or make sure for just the last chord, because like that, everything has been done, and you can handle that triumphant note once the choir's already done all the hard work, but you at least didn't obliterate them, overpower them before that. And frankly, on just the last chord, that could be extremely exciting. Just saving that for last, including, for example, a 32-foot reed in the pedal. Wait for just that last chord, and that could be that kind of delayed gratification usually is very well received. For service music, such as responses or choral amens, typically, these are brief and to the point, so use a clear and moderate registration that is immediately effective. So, you just maybe give a pitch, and then you have a fuller registration. Again, maybe avoid the mixtures and all of that for that. Those responses are usually not meant to be an important event, but, you want the congregation as well as the choir to feel well supported. So, again, within your romantic crescendo, it might be toward the third quarter of the crescendo. So if you have a 12-step romantic crescendo, maybe you might want to go for level general 8, general 7, depending on the power of that particular piston. Now, when you play from a piano reduction, which we often have to do, right? It's important to translate piano dynamics and articulations to the organ. So if you see a piano, and let's say you have a 12-step or 12 general romantic crescendo on your organ, and you see a piano, you might start with only general 3, and then you have the box closed. And if there's a slight crescendo from piano to mezzo piano, then you can open the boxes, and then if it goes back to piano, go back, close the boxes again a little bit. And it will make you sound like a master orchestrator. So make sure you translate those dynamics carefully, and then maybe you write in your general number for that. Be mindful of thick chords on the organ, right? Thick chords are, a pianist only having 2 hands. It actually doesn't sound bad on the piano when you do something like this, right? Which is a full. It doesn't sound bad, but on the organ, if you play that same chord, it does sound very bad. If you have, it creates a muddy effect, right? So on the organ, you might want to let go of the you might just want to keep the octave. Right? It's too much. It's too much. Too many pitches going on at the same time. So be ready to extract and remove some notes, especially in lower octaves. And then experiment with different colors to achieve the intended effect of the score. For example, if you have arpeggios in the piano score, but the arpeggios in the piano are often because the sound of the piano decays very rapidly, right? So in order to maintain that sustained effect, right, a lot of things on the piano are often arpeggiated. So for example, you have something like this. But all I'm doing is like 3 different chords, that's it. 3 chords, but I arpeggiate them to sustain sustain them, right? On the organ, you don't need to do that. So on the organ, for example, you could have, if I play the same thing. Without the it sounds almost insane on the organ, right? So you want to translate the intended effect from the piano to the organ when you play from the piano accompaniment. So then I have some specific stop considerations for choral accompaniment. The flutes of 8/4 and 2/5 pitch are excellent for blending, for warmth, and for sustaining choral lines. This is just generally speaking. The soft principles at 8 and 4 provide clarity without being overbearing. So, remember that they are your friend for when things start moving in an anthem, and suddenly there is, you went from a very slow, sustained moment to something now that has rhythm in 4/4. Bringing on soft principles will help convey that sense of motion to the choir. Strings 8 and 4, I think I recommend that you use those sparingly and with care, because even though they add shimmer, sometimes they can add a little too much shimmer to passages, and also they can sound thin and a little shrill if they're used too much or too early. So also it's best to avoid aggressive strings. Some strings are very bright, and very shrill. And sometimes you have an onda maris that you might have seen on the organ, and that tends to be a celeste flute, and that can be very gentle and a better solution in some cases. The celestes are great. They're wonderful stops. People love them because they create that ethereal, effect. And on this organ, they sound beautiful. So yeah, those are great. This is a perfectly voiced set of string and celeste, and they do have that shimmering quality that I mentioned. Then soft reeds, such as oboes or clarinet, ideally, in the swell, those reeds are not big. They're called color reeds. In this case here, the box closed is very prominent. It's because the sound doesn't really have anywhere to go, so it bounces and it's a little prominent. But on a large instrument, usually the oboe would be a nice, dainty, very gentle reed, and adding that to the texture will make it sound very warm. Unfortunately, here it's a little brighter than hope. It's also a smaller instrument. But color reeds, soft reeds like that are very useful, but use judiciously. Mixtures, again, use caution. They can add brilliance, but it can also obscure vocal lines if they are too prominent. So it's best reserved for full choral sections, such as in the Alleluia chorus, for example, in the introductory section, when you have that fugal section in the middle, maybe you remove the mixture and then bring it back for Alleluia, Alleluia, as you get closer to the end of the chorus. That can be really very useful and very exciting. So some practical tips in troubleshooting. Know your instrument, and building a romantic crescendo starts with really listening to every stop. Unfortunately, because every organ is unique, every space is unique, it really starts by knowing every individual stop on the organ. Right? So take time, spend time experimenting with different combinations and see how they work. But my personal advice is to preset your combinations or pistons, general pistons, so that once you learn to use effectively the different sound combinations, you have at your disposal an orchestra, literally, ready to serve for every dynamic need. And I'll bring you closer after I'm done talking so that you can see closer how I build up this romantic crescendo in this work. Listen critically. Step away from the console if you can and have someone play your registrations for you so that you can judge how things end up stacking up in that romantic crescendo. If the person cannot really play or doesn't know how to use those generals, maybe have them stand in the room and give you feedback. Another alternative is take your smartphone and record yourself. Put your phone in the middle of the center aisle, and then record yourself. Go through that romantic crescendo of yours and be honest with yourself. If you think something is beautiful, wonderful. But if something isn't as beautiful or there's a gap in dynamic, a huge dynamic gap, it's okay, it's not your fault. You did this based on what you heard at the console. But then maybe go back to that level and see how you can finesse that gap between two generals so that it's more, so that it's a smoother progression, right? And so that it really you can say, yes, this still sounds beautiful. And then consider the entire service. Is it going to be a funeral? Is it going to be an Easter Sunday service, right? That context influences how you register everything. And then flexibility, yes. Be prepared to adapt your registrations on the fly based on the choir's sound, congregational singing, or changes in the worship flow, right? Sometimes a lot of people get sick at the same time in winter, right? Cold flu season. So, you may have planned on having general 8 for this and general 9 for the climax, but then, only half the choir shows up. So maybe instead of starting with general 8, let's start with general 5, and then progress to general 6, right? It's all contextual, right? It all depends on where you start. If you start on general 3 and build up to 8, it's as effective as if you started on general 8 or on general 5 and then on general 10, right? It all depends on the progression. It's all proportional, right? Remember not to over-register. Less is often more. And, if Brondel Bradley had told me way too much organ, I would have been offended. Not offended, I would have been embarrassed, right? But at least he said, no, go more, and you want to leave people wanting more. So it's better to do less, because that is often more than doing too much. And then people say, the postlude was too loud, the prelude was too loud. It might be just simple, remove that mixture, right? It might just be too shrill. Also make sure you, by the way, set off hearing aids. It's extremely painful to people who wear hearing aids. Again, if the mixture is too strident for the texture under, right? Mixtures can cause problems. And the power of silence, don't be afraid of utilizing silence and very sparse textures for dramatic effect. One day, it was in our Christmas concert, and the last number of the concert, as the choir processes out with candles, is the singing of Silent Night every year. And one year, I don't know why, but the audience, I call them an audience because it was so many tourists, the St. Patrick's has actually a small congregational size, right? It's not in a residential area. We have 400 or so members, but the Christmas concerts attracts 5,000 people. So it's standing room only and all that. And people, that one Christmas concert, were singing their hearts out on Silent Night. And at one point, it's not a strong hymn. It's not a triumphant, victorious thing. It's a more subdued hymn. And people were so excited and all that, and at one point I just started dropping out and getting softer and softer and softer in my registrators until I basically just dropped out and let them finish Silent Night a cappella. And people broke out in applause. They were just so excited. Somehow the silence made it, give them all the feels. And so, sometimes silence can be a very effective tool. Before I demonstrate, and I invite you to come up close, do you have any questions about anything I just talked about? Did I say anything confusing or no? It's okay if I did, and I apologize if I did.
The other question, back to earlier, the pedaling. I noticed a lot of separation on passing a piece of it because of your shoes, or to articulate the bass line.
In hymns, it's intentionally separated.
Okay.
You know, a hymn you absolutely want to separate. For example, is Joyful Joy, right? It's you want to keep the melody legato. You want to articulate, especially the bass, because scientific experiments have shown that untrained musicians don't feel rhythm until they hear the bass. They
needed notice it would, but I don't know how the ascending, descending.
Exactly. Now in an anthem, and in fact, I have a printout of an anthem that you could sing along if you wanted to. But for example, in the bass, you might want to keep it legato because the choir has already practiced. But if you want. It's no longer about driving a congregation of people who have no musical training, right? The choir has training; it is trained by you, and then you can be more musical. In a hymn, you want to repeat notes, right? If you see a note on the hymnal page, play it, repeat it, and separate them. If you have repeated notes, separate them, and that actually helps drive the congregation forward and keep them from dragging. As promised, I will show you basically how I created I didn't create a full romantic on this organ, but basically with everything covered, coupled them into the gray and to the pedal, and feel free to come closer if you'd like to see, because the printing on the stops is rather small. But I start with the softest stop on the organ, and everything coupled to the gray and to the pedal, and in this case it's the swell form 8. This is the end of the box closed. It's not very effective, but right, this is my first general, so I will use this for pianist mode dynamic in an anthem. And then the next level up is not necessarily from the gray, from the swell, it might be from something else, say on the positive, that is very quiet also, but in this case it is from the swell. great. The Nazar, 2 2/3. The 2/5 principle from the positive. It's wider than the 2/5 as well, so I just go like terrace levels. Oh, this is where I stopped. Then I might add the oboe. I also gradually added more stops in the pedal, right, to make sure the pedal is also growing. I ran out of time then to keep adding things, but basically the mixtures are the last things you add, and you add the leads if they don't make the whole dynamic jump too much or too abruptly. Right? Did any of this make sense? It's kind of a horizontal way of thinking as opposed to just adding from the same division more and more, right? You just add horizontally from everything in a way that creates a terraced dynamic increase. And you go with the number of generals that you have. In some organs, when you have 8 generals like this one, some of them you have 6, some of them have 12, some of them have 20. You know, it really is the gamut. So you basically create a crescendo over what you have, and then you make it sound as good as you can. And these presets will make you a genius accompanist. People will say, "You're awesome," you know. And you know, because it will make sure that also at every dynamic, the organ always sounds beautiful. So, yeah, I hope this was helpful. It's 8:59. Technically, we have time for questions. Do you have any questions?
What can you ask in this short of time?
I know, right? I know. Fitting this
In
big
organ
topic
isn't
in
an
an hour.
ask kind of deal. It's more of a do and do and do kind of a deal. You know, organ is not, to me, it's just like, you have to soak it in.
Yes, it's a huge
You know.
endeavor. It takes time. It really takes time. I would say in the beginning, when I started learning how to build a romantic crescendo, it took me. And you know, I started doing that when I was hired at St. Patrick's. It was the largest organ I had ever been tasked with playing, and I frankly didn't know what I was doing. You know, what do you do? And so I learned. It took me a year to actually of attending master classes on how to register things. I took the train from New York and went to Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut, where Tom Murray, who was a legend teacher, was giving master classes on the art of registration, and I audited these classes. I was not a student, so I couldn't actually take them, but I attended them, I listened, I watched, and I really learned everything I know. And then I took that back to New York with me, and I started applying it to the organ at St. Patrick's. And then when I was at the recitals and other places, I applied the same principles. And I got much quicker over time at doing it, but it can be done. And like you said, don't give yourself 1 hour and then that's it, it's done. Take how long as it takes, right? Listen to every stop and say, okay, this is clearly the quietest stop on the entire organ. So this is going to be my channel 1. I'm going to put all the couplers to the pedal and all the couplers to the grate. Oh, I did that. There we go. And then you add the softest 16 foot in the pedal. Look at this. Right? This is my pianissimo, channel 1. Done. Right? That's a good place to start. And then once you've figured out the softest, and you know, it might also be the softest stuff might be on the choir or on the positive, right? You never know. Just go with whatever is the quietest. And then find the next quietest around the organ, throughout the organ, and it turned out to be the viola da gamba. Right? And even add that. And then once you've added that, that's your general 2, then for your Genre 3, what is the next quieter stop that starts building? And go from there. And it takes time to get to know every individual stop in the organ. And gradually you got the full orchestra organized in preset levels, and then the world is your oyster. The musical world, So it's hard to teach in an hour, it's hard to talk about it in 1 hour. The other day when I first did this class, I only had 45 minutes because it started late. So you actually got to hear and more of it and also ask more questions than you had the other day. So I hope I gave you something helpful to start with. And I believe some of these master classes on the art of registration are available on YouTube from Tom Murray at Yale. So if you want a refresher